In the future, we can say that we made an absolutely seminal contribution to addressing cancer and making it a manageable disease for the future.
Hello, you're watching Proactive. I'm joined by Angle's CEO, Andrew Newland. Good to see you, Andrew. The new research using Parsortix published in Nature appears to be creating quite a stir. Why is that?
Well, it's fabulous news. It's the development of a potential way of stopping the spread of cancer. So cancer spreads through the blood circulation in a process called metastasis, and if patients are unfortunate enough that their cancer progresses and they end up dying of that, that's almost always because of the metastatic spread of the cancer to secondary sites. And there's been a new study that's been published in Nature Medicine just now, actually, that is showing that a new way to stop that spread of the cancer, and that's all been enabled by our Parsortix system. So I'm incredibly proud of the contribution that Angle has made to this with our Parsortix system, which obviously we can explain in a bit more detail, but very grateful to our investors and team for the fabulous work that they've done.
Andrew, can you explain how all this works? What work has been achieved using Parsortix, and why do you believe that may help cancer patients?
Yeah, I can explain it. It's actually fairly simple, and that is that cancer spreads by cancer cells leaving the primary tumor, so the first place that the cancer is found, and going into the bloodstream, where they're then renamed circulating tumor cells, but essentially cancer cells that have left the primary tumor. They go in the blood and then they circulate, and then they can land somewhere else. And if they land in another organ, they can start growing as secondary cancer. And as I just mentioned, that's what likely can kill the patient. So that process has been investigated in great depth using Angle's Parsortix system to recover the cancer cells from blood. And there's a very preeminent group in Switzerland, which is led by Professor Nicola Aceto, and he was in Basel and he's now in Zurich with a laboratory that specializes in this called the Cancer Metastasis Laboratory. And over multiple years, they've done work using our Parsortix system to investigate these cancer cells. And what they found was that there's a certain type of grouping of those cells, which are called clusters, which is where instead of an individual cancer cell being in the blood, you can see a group of cancer cells known as a circulating tumor cell cluster. And what they've done is they have developed a way, the first part was that they proved that these clusters of cells are very, very strongly associated with the cancer progression. In fact, they published that they're over 100 times more important and dangerous to the patient, if you like, than individual cells. So they set about trying to disassociate these circulating tumor cell clusters into individual cells, so sort of separate the cluster into the individual cells. And they found first in a mouse model that could be achieved using some relatively inexpensive and already FDA cleared cardiac drugs. And then not only could that be achieved in mice, but the mice then lived much longer, and in fact were pretty much cured of their cancer because it didn't progress within the mice compared to exactly identical mice that hadn't been treated with the cardiac drug. So what's been announced today is the next phase of that work, which is really breakthrough work, which is that they have examined the exact same thing in patients, in breast cancer patients, and they showed that by using these commonly used FDA cleared cardiac drugs, which can be used for example, arrhythmia or atrial fibrillation control, that kind of thing, they were able to disassociate these clusters into individual cells. And they did all of that with the Parsortix system. So it couldn't have even started without Parsortix. They used the Parsortix system to identify whether the patients had these circulating tumor cell clusters in the first instance. And then they administered the drug. And then they proved, using the Parsortix system, that the clusters had reduced down into smaller clusters or individual cells. So reason this is exciting is because we see this as a possible way of stopping the spread of cancer. And from a point of view of the Angle's interest particularly, this is absolutely driven by the use of Parsortix and requires Parsortix in order to be identify the right patients and assess how well that is happening.
Andrew, what's the next steps in bringing this breakthrough new development to the market?
So they've done, like I said, they've done the first part, which is to demonstrate that they can separate these clusters with these new sort of, what I call them cluster buster drugs. They used a drug called digoxin for separating the clusters, and I call that a cluster buster. So they used these cluster busters and they separated the CTC clusters. The next level will be to demonstrate that the patients actually have a better outcome compared to patients who don't get given that cardiac drug. In other words, they need to show that the cancer is not progressing and get a better overall survival and progression-free survival. So the read across to Angle in that is that there's going to have to be a lot more trials. So I'm expecting there to be worldwide interest in this development, and we will see many, many cancer research groups around the world thinking, well, we better investigate this as well. So there'll be a lot of demand for Parsortix because you need Parsortix to be able to do this. There's a very good level of confidence that this may be achievable, that patients can benefit like this. And the reason I say that is because in the 80s and 90s, there were some studies that showed that cardiac glycocytes, which is this form of drug that I've just talked about, coincidentally did relate to better outcomes from cancer. But unfortunately, there's some studies on that, and one in 85, for example, in the 90s, wasn't progressed because nobody understood the metastatic cascade and nobody understood what this meant. And obviously, these drugs have some side effects, etc. But now we do understand that metastatic cascade through the Parsortix system and the years of work that the Osito lab have done. It really does open up a major probability. And then beyond that, I'm anticipating that obviously there's a number of years of trials before this actually hits the patient market to benefit patients. And during that process, I expect to see Parsortix used in many trials to the benefit of those trials and obviously to Angle. But once it gets to market, I would foresee that any regulatory clearance is likely to be initially targeted on later stage patients, because that's where it's easier to prove a benefit initially. Obviously, eventually, it might actually go all the way through down to early stage cancer. And therefore, there will be a need for a routine assessment with Parsortix to assess whether the patients actually got the circulating tumor cell clusters in the first place, and also to monitor whether or not they benefit from it. So, and even beyond that, I would anticipate that a patient being treated in this way, which could have a very major benefit to them, is still going to have the concern of possibly cancer relapse. So there would be the obvious ongoing routine monitoring where you would check the patient's blood to make sure the circulating tumor cell clusters are not present. And of course, if they became present, now you've got a treatment to get rid of them. So this whole thing is a really, really exciting area and very, very good for Angle, because it just demonstrates what we've been saying for a very, very long time, which is if you can get living cancer cells and particularly large clusters of cancer cells out of patient blood, you can learn a tremendous amount about how the cancer is progressing. And now there's a new class of drugs that's being developed to address that. So it's very exciting all around.
I mean, how do you see this impacting Angle in the future, Andrew?
Right now, Nature Medicine is a highly prestigious scientific journal, arguably the leading one in the world. So it's very high profile. So we would expect many of our customer base or potential customer base to be able to see that publication. And it gives credibility to other people who may want to look at ways of preventing the metastatic spread of disease as a new class. So broadly speaking, cancer drugs are currently focused on attacking and trying to kill off the existing tumours. Whereas this is a new approach, which is to do with stopping the cancer spreading and containing it. So that's very exciting. But I think there's read across also into other new classes of drugs that could be understood better by using Parsortix. And we're already seeing the likes of AstraZeneca investing in looking at androgen receptor protein as a potential new way of assessing prostate cancer. We've got new classes of drugs like antibody drug conjugates. So Eisai is already using Parsortix system for HER2 antibody drug conjugates. So all of this is a very strong read across to what is our standard business. That the metastatic cascade is extremely important. But overall, my vision and hope, and I'm sure there's many millions of people who would share this hope, is that we could actually contain cancer and move it just like AIDS used to be a death sentence, and it was moved across to become HIV positive, which could be controlled with retroviral drugs as a new class of drugs. I'm really hoping that it'll be a number of years before this is achieved, but in the future we can say that we made an absolutely seminal contribution to addressing cancer and making it a manageable disease for the future. So this is all very good news for Angle. Thank you very much.
All right, Andrew, congratulations again on that development, and thank you very much for speaking with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
That's Angle CEO Andrew Newland.